Hey there! Ready to dig into some seriously spooky history? This deep dive is all about unearthing the unexpected origins of your favorite Halloween traditions. Buckle up, because we're about to uncover some truly bizarre facts. Might even make you see that bowl of candy corn a little differently.
What's so interesting about Halloween is how many traditions we just, accept without a second thought. But when you really look at their roots, they're often far different and sometimes much stranger.
Okay, gotta unpack this now. You're telling me Halloween has more to it than meets the eye. Don't hold out on me.
Take the jack-o'-lantern. Most people, they picture pumpkins, right? But those original jack-o'-lanterns, they were carved from turnips.
Hold on, turnips? Are you serious? Imagine craving a turnip spice latte this fall. That was our ancestors' reality. Okay, but why turnips in the first place? What's the story?
Well, it all goes back to that Irish legend, Stingy Jack. He's this trickster who outsmarts the devil, but ends up cursed. Stuck wandering the afterlife with only a carved-out turnip to light his way. And then when those Irish immigrants came to America, they found pumpkins. Native to the Americas, way easier to carve.
And bam, the pumpkin spice takeover was born. It's crazy how a simple swap, like turnips to pumpkins, can totally change a tradition. But speaking of surprising origins, I heard a rumor that Halloween used to be about finding love. Is there any truth to that?
Oh, absolutely. Back in the 18th century, Halloween, it was as much about romance as it was about, warding off spirits. Young women, they'd use apples and nuts in all these rituals, hoping for a glimpse of their future husband.
So instead of swiping right, they were tossing apple peels over their shoulders. Talk about a different dating game. Okay, but what kind of rituals are we talking about here?
One tradition was killing an apple in one long strip. You toss it over your shoulder. And the letter it made when it landed, that was supposed to be the initial of your soulmate.
Whoa, talk about high-stakes apple bobbing. Makes you wonder, did our ancestors trust a burning walnut shell more than we trust dating apps? But on a serious note, it's pretty amazing how Halloween went from romance to spooky costumes and trick-or-treating.
Really shows how cultural perceptions, traditions, they can totally change over time. And speaking of transformations, gotta mention Halloween costumes. These days, it's all about, being creative, standing out. But originally, costumes had a different purpose, blending in with the dead.
Okay, that's both creepy and genius. Tell me more.
So the ancient Celts, they believed that on Samhain, the veil between the living and the dead was super thin. Costumes, often made from animal skins or with grotesque masks, were meant to confuse those spirits, stop them from recognizing and possibly possessing the living.
Now that's high-stakes fashion. Can you imagine those ancient Celts seeing today's costumes? Like superheroes, pop stars, those inflatable dinosaurs. They'd probably be terrified and confused.
And that fear of the spirit world wasn't just costumes. It ran so deep, there's even a name for the fear of Halloween. Samhainophobia.
Samhainophobia, the fear of Halloween. That's a real thing.
Oh, it is. And while it might seem odd now, it shows how real those anxieties were for our ancestors. The thinning veil between worlds, it wasn't just spooky decorations for them. It was a time when that barrier between living and dead, it really blurred.
From worrying about the afterlife, let's talk about worrying about what's in our treats. We've gone from homemade goodies to mountains of candy, but it wasn't always easy, right?
You got it. That shift, homemade to mass-produced candy in the 20th century, it wasn't just convenience. There was this growing unease about what could be hiding in those wrappers.
I'm guessing this is where the whole poisoned candy myth comes in. Even though it was mostly debunked, it really captured people's imaginations, didn't it?
Absolutely. The 1950s, 60s, you saw these urban legends popping up, anxieties about, anonymous threats, a changing world. It's interesting how societal fears, even if they're based on myth, can still shape traditions.
So from poison candy paranoia to the rise of trick-or-treating as we know it, Halloween's always been about balancing that sweet tooth without smarting those mischievous spirits, hasn't it? But let's rewind where trick-or-treating come from in the first place. Didn't just start with kids demanding candy, right?
Nope. It goes back to this medieval practice called souling. People would go door to door, but they'd offer prayers for the dead in exchange for soul cakes.
Soul cakes. Were those as good as they sound?
Yeah.
Tell me more about this souling. So instead of trick-or-treating, it was more like praying for treating. Huh. It's amazing how a ritual about, mourning and remembering could turn into costumes and candy. But I gotta ask, what about those medieval soulers? Did they wear costumes?
Oh, you bet. Costumes were huge. Even back then, people would dress up as saints, angels, even the dead themselves. Really blurred those lines between this world and the afterlife.
Talk about method acting. But it wasn't all somber costumes and prayers, right? Halloween's always had a mischievous side. Didn't it used to be known for getting a little rowdy?
You're thinking of Mischief Night. Pranks, mayhem, that was the name of the game. We're talking soaped windows, outhouses tipped over, even letting livestock loose in town.
Wow, that's a far cry from leaving out a bowl of candy. Our modern trick-or-treating seems pretty tame compared to that. But why all the mischief? What was the point?
Well, some thought it was a way to, blow off steam, act out against those social norms, especially during tough times. Others figured it was about appeasing those mischievous spirits we've been talking about. A little chaos in exchange for a year of peace,
Makes you wonder if those ancient pranksters ever imagined their antics would turn into trick-or-treating. But before we get too lost in the candy, let's go back to something you mentioned, using sound to ward off spirits. Those bone flutes really caught my attention. What's the story there?
You're talking about using eerie sounds to scare off evil, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so during Samhain, people would play these instruments made from bone, believing those unsettling sounds, they could drive away any lingering spirits.
Bone flutes. That's both creepy and so cool. Like the original spooky soundtrack, I can only imagine how eerie that must have been, those sounds in the dead of night.
It's really interesting how music, sound, it's always been tied to our fears or superstitions, especially when it comes to the supernatural. You can see that even today, with how we use soundtracks, sound effects in horror movies, creaking doors, whispers, all meant to make you uneasy.
It's amazing how those ancient practices still influence us, still give us those chills and thrills. But bone flutes weren't the only protection, right? You mentioned bonfires too.
Absolutely. Bonfires, those were huge. During Samhain, they'd light these massive fires, not just to ward off evil, but also to kind of welcome in winter. People would dance around the flames, sometimes throwing things into the fire, offerings to the spirits, or maybe a way to let go of bad stuff from the past year.
It's interesting how fire, it can be both destructive and purifying. It shows up in so many traditions: warmth, light, but also transformation, new beginnings. But fire wasn't the only thing thought to have power on Halloween, right? Didn't you mention church bells too?
You got it. Ringing church bells, especially on Halloween night, that was common too. That sound, those bells echoing in the dark, people believed it could drive away any evil lurking around.
So between the bone flutes, the bonfires, the church bells, Halloween must have been a loud event, a whole symphony of spooky sounds. But amidst all that protection and eerie noise, there was also, fortune telling, right? Especially when it came to love.
Yeah, you're right. Because even with all the worry about spirits, people still wanted to know about their future, especially when it came to romance. In Ireland, they'd bake this bread, barmbrack, specifically for Halloween. Hidden inside were all these little objects. Each one meant something different. Find a ring in your slice meant marriage was coming. A coin meant wealth and good fortune.
It's like a Halloween fortune cookie, but with extra carbs. I'm
Yeah.
here for it. What other things did they bake in there?
Well, if you were unlucky enough to get a piece of cloth, that meant bad luck, maybe even poverty, was headed your way.
Talk about a recipe for indigestion. It makes you wonder, what other creative ways did they have to try and see the future? Weren't there rituals with walnut shells too?
Oh yeah, they would take 2 walnut halves representing a couple and toss them in the fire. If they burned together side by side, that was a good sign for the relationship. But if one popped or they separated, that meant trouble ahead.
I guess some things never change, huh? Relationships have always had their ups and downs. Speaking of looking ahead, you mentioned how Samhain was a time when the veil between worlds was thin, allowing glimpses of the past and future. That's a pretty profound idea.
It is. And it's something that we're still fascinated by today, right?
Yeah.
I mean, look at our obsession with time travel. Imagine if we could actually harness that energy of Halloween to really experience those ancient rituals or even get a peek at our own destinies.
Now that would be a Halloween party trick. But even without the time travel, there are some pretty weird beliefs around Halloween, like wearing your clothes inside out to ward off evil.
Oh, yeah. The idea was spirits would be confused, thrown off by the unexpected.
So it's all about messing with their heads, right? Throwing a wrench in their plans with like a fashion curveball. It's hilarious, but also kind of genius.
Exactly. Sometimes the best way to face your fears is with a little humor, and a willingness to embrace the unexpected.
Speaking of unexpected, let's talk about a darker side of Halloween's past. I'm talking about the use of, human remains in rituals and traditions. It's not something you hear about often. Are you ready to dive into that?
Let's tread carefully, but yeah, there are definitely some historical practices linked to Halloween that are downright macabre. One example that comes to mind is the creation of corpse candles, lanterns made from human fat.
Corpse candles. That's both horrifying and intriguing. Who would even think to make something like that?
It's a gruesome thought. These lanterns were supposedly used by grave robbers, body snatchers back in the 18th century. They'd use them to light their way through cemeteries.
I can't imagine anything creepier than navigating a graveyard at night with a corpse candle. Gives me chills just thinking about it.
It's a chilling reminder that Halloween has a dark side, a history that's not all fun and games. Those corpse candles are a far cry from our friendly jack-o'-lanterns.
They definitely are. And while we're talking about eerie omens and unsettling sounds, there's a particularly creepy belief about Halloween and dogs. Have you ever heard about the significance of a dog howling on Halloween night?
Oh, yeah, that's an old one. In English folklore, a dog howling on Halloween, that was a bad omen. It meant death was coming.
It makes sense in a way, dogs being so in tune with their surroundings and all, but still, a howling dog on Halloween night, pure nightmare fuel.
It's definitely an unsettling image. It shows how folklore and superstition can take something ordinary, like a dog howling, and turn it into something eerie and unsettling, especially on a night like Halloween. But on a lighter note, remember those protective turnips we talked about earlier?
Those little veggie guardians, how could I forget?
Well, it turns out they were even more multi-talented than we thought. Besides being lanterns and charms, people in Ireland and Scotland would also hang turnips from their homes. They believed it would confuse spirits, keep them from getting inside.
So not only were turnips protectors, but they were masters of disguise too. Who knew a simple root vegetable could have so many tricks up its sleeve?
Right. It just goes to show how resourceful people were back then, finding all sorts of uses for everyday objects. But speaking of resourcefulness, have you ever heard about the tradition of hiding your clothes to protect yourself from witches?
Wait, what? Hiding your clothes? Now that's a new one.
It might sound strange, but in Scotland, people believe that witches could use your personal belongings, especially clothing, to cast spells on you. So to be safe, they'd hide their clothes on Halloween night, making it impossible for any witches to work their magic.
That's both clever and a little bit paranoid. Makes you wonder what other unusual practices people came up with to outsmart those mischievous spirits and witches. Like, did they ever try reasoning with them, offering them a nice cup of tea?
Maybe. But as we get deeper into Halloween's history, we start to see traditions that go beyond just protection. We're talking about practices that blur the lines between the real world and the supernatural, between the living and the dead.
Okay, now you've really got me intrigued. What kind of traditions are we talking about? I'm ready for my mind to be blown.
Get ready, because we're about to explore the fascinating link between Halloween and the idea of time travel, a concept that has always captivated humanity.
Time travel. Wow, didn't see that one coming. This deep dive just keeps getting more and more interesting.
Hold on tight, because things are about to get really fascinating. We're going to uncover some of the most intriguing and overlooked aspects of Halloween, revealing the hidden connections between this ancient holiday, time travel, and the human desire to go beyond the limits of what we know.
Okay, so time travel and Halloween, huh? I'm hooked. How do those two things even go together?
Well, we've been talking about how, for the ancient Celts, Samhain was this time when the veil between worlds was super thin, right? Like a doorway between the past, present, and future.
So it wasn't just spirits coming through, but also the possibility of seeing into other times. That's pretty wild to think about.
Exactly. And during Samhain, people would do rituals, try to predict the future, maybe even talk to those who had passed on. It was like their understanding of time, it wasn't so rigid, so linear as ours is now.
You know, it makes you wonder, right? Like our fascination with time travel, all those stories about going back in time or to the future, maybe it comes from this deep desire to connect with people from the past or to know what's coming next. It's like a basic human thing.
Yeah, it's an intriguing thought. What if those old rituals, those attempts to see the future, were kind of an early form of that? A way to reach beyond the limits of time, even if they didn't have the technology we have now. Who's to say they weren't onto something?
It would be amazing to actually experience what those Samhain celebrations were like. Imagine maybe with virtual reality, we could actually go back in time and see those rituals happening. That would be something else.
Can you imagine? Put on a headset and you're suddenly in an ancient village on the eve of Samhain. You could feel the heat from the bonfires, hear that eerie music, maybe even spot something strange moving in the shadows.
Okay, that's both awesome and terrifying at the same time. Going through all this, it really hits you that Halloween is so much more than just dressing up and getting candy. It's about those ancient fears and beliefs that human need to understand the things we can't explain.
It really is. And those feelings, that wonder and unease about what's out there, it's still with us, even today.
It definitely is. So as we're getting ready for Halloween, carving our pumpkins and everything, it's cool to think about the history behind it all. And hey, maybe when you're making those jack-o'-lantern faces, you'll feel a little connected to the people who celebrated Halloween long ago with their own mix of fear, wonder, and maybe a little mischief too.
Until next time, happy Halloween.